Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast, we look at the growth of the backyarding and so-called micro units within many areas of South Africa's cities and the economic and accommodation opportunities that these units are affording. Our episode takes us to Gauteng in the Western Cape. It takes us to the banks of the Yuxkay in Alexandra, Johannesburg, and the historic townships of Orlando and Zola in Soweto. It takes us south to the Western Cape, to the Cape Flats and Delft South. In the episode, we consider the challenges and opportunities that have been afforded by these housing units, and starts to consider some of the questions around the builders who are building them and the regulations that are either being imposed or causing their own issues in terms of the availability and the sustainability of this type of housing model. My own eureka moment in respect of this phenomena that we've seen within our townships was when I was monitoring and collecting data on informal settlements in the mid to late 2000s. The informal settlements were pretty much what the government had been tracking up until that point, and in spite of mixed messaging from the government around the eradication and or upgrading of informal settlements, an issue that we dealt with in the first of our We Must Talk About Housing episodes in this series, the emphasis seemed to increasingly become focused on not just the informal settlement but informal accommodation that was being made available with this type of development, i.e. the backyarding and the micro units. The quantum and the growth of these units by virtue of their scale and spatial location was becoming as important an accommodation supply as the informal settlements and the RDP or Reconstruction Development Programme. This is particularly prevalent within that gap market housing, which struggles to gain access to bank loan and finance, whilst also earning more money than can be accommodated within the initial housing subsidy within that giveaway housing product. Shouldn't we be thinking of this mode of typology, this as being the de facto new cities of South Africa, in terms of the aesthetics, the supply, and the gaps that these typologies are filling? But then if that is the case, then what is the role of the regulator? The regulator in terms of the density and the need that arises out of that increased density, the social, the physical infrastructure, the safety, the building standards, the environmental health. All of these are aspects that we're going to consider in today's episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. The episode focuses on some of the research and findings through three eminent academics who've studied this phenomena over the last decade or more. We look at some of the commonalities, the differences, the opportunities, and some of the shortcomings. To help me understand this, I'm joined tonight by Sarah Charlton and Margot Rubin, Associate Professors at the Wits University School of Architecture and Planning, and also by Rob McGaffin, a researcher at the Urban Real Estate Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. Rob has also worked within the private sector, where he's developed a keen interest in property economics and the costing of construction techniques. As always, we hope you enjoy the episode and invite you to interact with us through our Twitter platform, that's on Talking Transfo and the number 1, or feel free to leave us a voice message on the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message app that is available via that particular platform. I should also just mention that this episode was recorded 2 nights before the country, South Africa, goes into a national lockdown, as announced by President Ramaphosa last night being the 23rd of March, today is the 24th of March. So things are changing rapidly in South Africa right now and across the world, as you'd well be aware. I can't stress enough how much I appreciate the time and the effort of our 3 guests tonight, and to you, the listener, for tuning in and supporting the podcast. We hope you enjoy the episode. So it's a Tuesday evening and I'm live on the Skype line with 3 colleagues around the country. Up in Johannesburg, we've got Margot Rubin and Sarah Charlton. Margot, Sarah, how are you keeping?
Yep, we're good, thanks. How are you?
Thanks, Pete.
We're all good this side. Thanks, guys. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. And down here in the Western Cape, Cape Town, Rob McGaffin. Rob, how are you keeping? You all well today?
All good, thanks, Pete.
Really appreciate your time and effort, colleagues. I appreciate we're heading 48 hours away from a monumental day in the country's history. So thank you for finding time and making the effort to talk to us this evening about this incremental approach to informal and semi-formal development happening in our townships. And the three of you have been studying this for quite some time, and I was really looking forward to hearing your different insights and the different research that you have been involved in over the last few years. In fact, some of you have been at this for almost a decade or more. How are we shaping up here in South Africa? Sarah, let's start with you in terms of this whole sort of debate around new cities and city form, density. These are issues that we typically hear about through things like the National Development Plan, Spatial Planning, Land Use Management Act, all these fancy words in the legislation. And when we hear the president talk about a new city, often I've been thinking more and more about, well, it's the new city is happening more in this incremental fashion, backyards of people's existing houses. Is this a fair way to assess what the new city is? What's your take on it?
Peter, I would agree with you that there's a huge contrast between some of the visions that politicians and developers right across Africa and in fact across the world are thinking about, which tend to be these very formal, glossy, sort of high-rise type of new-built places that suggest a future of prosperity, of employment, of very formal type of living, and they've been critiqued as kind of fantasy ideas. And there's a huge contrast between that sort of idea and what we're actually seeing going on all around us, which is what you're pointing to, these changes to our existing cities that are happening despite our policy intentions, often without us realizing they're happening until we sort of wake up one day and realize that a whole lot has changed around us that we weren't anticipating. So there's an awful lot going on that is really suggesting a different way in which cities are evolving, a different set of actors that are actually shaping cities. And there's a huge contrast between these two kind of visions, as I think you're very rightly pointing to.
Margot, when we hear President Ramaphosa talking about the new city, the fourth industrial revolution and so forth, what's your immediate thoughts when you hear those sort of comments and this idea of something that's somewhat different in some of the research that you've been looking at?
My initial response is actually terror. It fills me with absolute dread when I hear this idea that we're going to be thinking about producing new cities somewhere in the middle of the veldt or somewhere else. It seems to be completely out of touch with what is needed in cities. It seems to be completely out of touch with the day-to-day realities. And it kind of makes me worry about, if we do go for that model, what happens to everybody who's left behind? What happens to informal settlements and backyard dwellings and all the other stuff that is actually de facto what is going on every day, in building the city? Are they just going to be relegated to kind of this dystopian urban reality, while everyone who can afford it is pushed into these new kind of urban visions, as Sarah points to? So I worry a great deal when I hear this kind of speech. It just leaves me feeling that a lot of the work we have been doing and what we have been pointing to about the importance of informality is just being ignored, or once again is completely devalued.
Rob, I've heard you talk on several occasions in and around Cape Town talking about this sort of transit-orientated development and what some of the reality checks when it comes to TOD and that sort of thing are in relation to a reality on the ground. I mean, your thoughts, your observations as sort of introductory remarks on this.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on the comment of this idea of new cities, I mean, I would agree with Margot. I mean, I think it's completely pie in the sky stuff, because, it's not just about creating housing. It's not, if you go and build housing, you're not building a city. And cities take, hundreds of years of investment, layers of it, to actually develop it to the point there where we see our cities today. And that layers of both public investment and private investment over hundreds of years. Schools, universities, businesses, industry, that takes a long time, and you don't just automatically create that. And so, I mean, I just think it's completely taking one's eye off the ball.
If pace is one of the major ingredients around sort of city building and the speed and sort of aspiration versus reality, the one thing that I think is undisputed is that what we're seeing is in some of our former black townships, the growth and the rise of these backyard and micro units. And we'll talk about what differentiates them in the coming conversation. But certainly what we've seen is a landscape that's changed very, very rapidly, quick speed, in reaction to typically sort of state investment around a site, service, title deed, and then a top structure. And then we've seen this thing move in a very, very quick way.
I think that that's something that Sarah and I came across and we're reminded of by Alan Mabin, was that this isn't a new phenomenon. Backyarding has very much been a feature of townships' life for 50, 60 years kind of thing. 100%. So, we originally, the state invested kind of housing that was put into townships. I mean, had backyards has had backyarding for a very long time, or rooms to rent, however you want to phrase it, for a long time. Sure. But I think we have to be careful not to name it as a new phenomenon, but rather as a continuation of something that's been happening for a very long time in these kinds of places in responses to very similar forces, which may have sped up, but have certainly been in place for decades.
No, thank you for the reminder, Margot. And we will certainly talk about the Orlando and the Zola experience there, which, as you say, sort of long established historic townships there within Soweto, for example. So if I'm talking about a post-1994 with all of the RDP type of interventions and so forth, there seems to have been certain ingredients which seem to lead to a particular rhythm and a particular speed of change that we've seen, whether it's the cannibalization of the existing RDP house into a much bigger structure, or via a sort of informal shack development in the back. And maybe it's worth having a discussion right now about what are the differences between some of the micro units. And Rob, I think you did some work on these micro units down in around Delft South, in around Khayelitsha Park, and how that contrasts with, for example, up in Alexandra and some of the work that you did there, Sarah, with regards to the Alexandra model. So Rob, maybe do you want to start with what do we mean when we talk about these micro units? What does it look like? What differentiates it from being another structure associated with the primary residence?
Just to pick up on Margot's point and maybe Alan Maven's point, because I actually think it's a really important one. This is all part of an urban development process, and the densification of cities over time has been occurring for hundreds of years. And I don't know Johannesburg that well, but Hillbrow was single residential houses at one point in time, and then was redeveloped into higher density flats, etc. The same way that you're seeing single residential RDP houses being redeveloped into higher density units as well. So I think it's a very important point to pick, to recognize that this is very much a natural process that occurs in cities.
If we're looking at this differentiation, do you see a differentiation between these sort of micro units in and around Delft and Khayelitsha Parks versus the sort of backyarding units?
I actually think the property economics and the land economics is exactly the same than what we saw with the redevelopment of Hillbrow. It's just happening at a slightly different scale. The difference between what you're saying, the backyarding, and maybe the sort of more double-story 8 to 12 rental units that you're seeing in Delft South, etc. I mean, we very broadly, and maybe I'm not even sure if this is a correct categorization, but we sort of differentiated between owner developers and enterprise developers. And owner developers, which you'll often see in places like Khayelitsha Park and Khayelitsha, and in some parts of Delft South, these are existing owners who are basically extending their properties, and they will be putting maybe 2 to 4 units in their backyard or on the land available on their particular properties. And they're doing it for 2 reasons. They're either just extending their accommodation, so just making their accommodation larger. That's often for extended family, or it is an income generation. So they're renting them out to supplement their income. They, however, have no real intention to replicate the process. They do it once, that's it, they carry on. What I call sort of enterprise developers are people who will actually acquire a property. It's often an RDP property, In many cases, they will flatten the original structure because it's poorly constructed, it's poorly located on the site, and they will develop a double-story unit, slightly larger than what we see in the sort of homeowner type of developers. And they'll rent these out to 8 to 12 tenants. And they're looking to develop these on other sites as well. So they're looking to go and acquire other sites and to continue the process, right? So that is their business, where the homeowner tends to be more of a supplementary exercise. Now, those are very broad categorizations, and there's probably a whole lot of categories between those two. But broadly, those were the two sort of trends that we saw.
Sarah, in terms of some of the work that you did up in Alexandra, I mean, how does that story that Rob is describing, how is the sort of characteristics similar to, or how does it differ up there in Gauteng, in and around some of the studies that you did in and around Alexandra?
Yeah, I think it's a really useful distinction that Rob's making, and it's very clear to kind of see the distinction that's being made there. But I think I would just like to add that one sees backyarding, if we're sort of going to use that sort of terminology, actually take multiple forms. So physically, there are just huge. There's a huge diversity. The sort of enterprise developers that Rob's talking about are more typically using very a formal construction, often double story, that sort of thing. But one's also seeing that kind of formal construction by the individual homeowner who's just constructing a few rooms to rent. But also, sometimes at the opposite end of the spectrum, the very sort of precarious building materials, the much more shack-like type of units, often many of those on one site, and also, many different configurations actually on the plot. So although we tend to use the term backyarding, often it's not in the backyard. It might be on the side, it might be in the front. The work that's been done at WITS, Margot and I have both been involved in supervising students over the years who've done really interesting, often very small-scale studies, but across Gauteng in different localities. And there is a lot of sort of richness and diversity in not just the physical structures, but the arrangements between tenants and landlords, the access to ablutions, whether ablutions are individual or shared, the means of payment in cash or in kind. So I think it's a really interesting, very rapidly sort of evolving terrain where there's lots going on. And I think it's also quite interesting to look at where it's happening, because I think there's been quite a lot of attention paid in recent times to the great scale at which this is occurring. And you were referring, Pete, to the developments that are happening in RDP neighborhoods. But it is also happening in the older townships, as we've mentioned just now, to a great extent. Also, older so-called sort of white suburbs that are transforming quite rapidly along these lines. Certainly in Johannesburg, in places like Yeoville and Rosettenville, well-located areas where there's a lot of change happening, including the more sort of enterprise developer type rooms being built. And perhaps one of the interesting questions is, why is it happening in those sorts of areas, those three kinds of areas that we've been speaking about, but not in some other neighborhoods? I mean, there is actually quite an uneven spatial distribution if you look at cities as a whole. And is that just to do with which areas are more actively policed, if one wants to put it that way, in terms of various kind of building regulations and town planning regulations, which areas are more policed and which areas aren't? So perhaps that's one of the interesting questions, is why isn't it happening more rapidly in predominantly former white suburbs?
Do you want to comment on that side, Margot? Anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually something that Sarah also reminds us of quite a lot, which is that we shouldn't also just think about this as purely a residential market, because it isn't. The conversion of rooms and spaces and properties is also for other kinds of activities, kind of commercial activities. So shebeens, spaza shops, hair salons, all kinds of things, and these spaces are being converted and reconfigured into a multiplicity of uses. I think we have to remember that, when we talk about this, it's actually the creation very often of mixed use kinds of environments as well. And I think it's important to note, because when we think about what's being pushed in terms of kind of planning ideals of densification, mixed use, mixed whatever, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of these rooms and spaces for rent really do satisfy these criteria. I'd just like to raise that as well.
No, I think that makes complete sense. I mean, here we are, you're describing, exactly the things that we're looking for: diversity in land use, density, a supply side for a market which typically struggles to access the housing market. So, Rob, what is the problem then? Why don't we just upscale this and be done with it? And there's the housing problem solved. What's the issue?
Pete, sorry to want to pick up on the previous discussion before I answer a question again.
But you're very welcome.
I think both Sarah and Margot's points are actually really interesting, and I think they're related. Sarah's point of, why isn't this happening in a kind of homogenous way? Well, why is it differentiated? And we're seeing that down in Cape Town as well. And I have a proposition around it. I'm not sure that it is the real reason as such, but I suspect when you speak to these developers, I mean, they're actually very savvy, especially the sort of enterprise type of developers, and that they know where the market is in terms of people who will rent that space. So you've got to ask yourself, you'll see more of these developments happening in certain locations. And it's because tenants want to take up space in those locations. And Margot is correct. It's not just residential tenants, it's commercial tenants as well. And so, for instance, we're seeing in Khayelitsha, etc., you're seeing quite a lot of it happening around Elita Park and those areas, which, with respect to Khayelitsha, is actually quite a well-located suburb. I mean, in terms of the broader city, it's not well located, but within Khayelitsha itself.
Understood, yeah.
It's close to the town centre, it's close to public transport, etc., etc., etc. So you've got a lot of tenants who want to live there. Or, you've got a lot of people who want to live in that space, and hence there's a demand to rent in those locations, and those developers are responding to it. And you'll see often as well, just at a more micro level, you'll see how many of these type of developments are happening on major sort of transport routes or quite, and there clearly that makes sense for the more commercial but related tenant. So I think it's because of the location of these areas on the demand side, i.e. they're quite attractive areas to live. And then perhaps Sarah's right on, in terms of supplying into these areas, it's maybe the areas that are possibly slightly less policed, or it's easier to do the development in those areas. To move on then to your question around, what are the issues or what are the problems? Pete, I think, to be honest with you, maybe there aren't so many problems, because I don't think we recognize the scale at which this is actually happening. I'm of the opinion it is the largest supplier of housing in Cape Town, hands down. And if you just, I've been tracking it since about 2011. And if you actually look at the numbers, and they are relatively anecdotal, although there have been some preliminary surveys that have been done, we're talking about thousands of units here. I don't think the problem maybe is as big as we think. It's happening, and people are getting on with it. The problems may come in a little bit in terms of what are the implications of it. So what are the levels in terms of perhaps overcrowding of public facilities, the impact on infrastructure, some of those type of issues we perhaps need to look at. There clearly are some issues on the supply side. And when we've spoken to these developers, there are two things that have come up, three things that have come up. One is access to finance. The other one is the quality of some of the subcontractors and the quality of the construction process. And in some cases, it is the resistance from the authorities with respect to these developments. But again, that varies, because in some cases in Cape Town, we've had a very facilitative local authority who have tried to assist this process. But in other planning regions, there's been a pushback against these developments. So I'd say those are your three main problems.
If I remember correctly from your paper, you were suggesting that in, for example, Cape Town, there's plus minus 8,000 to 10,000 formal units or houses being delivered every year. And with the growth that we're seeing in terms of household formations and migration and so forth, we're just simply unable to keep up with that. If I understood, I think it was like 30,000 houses would need to be supplied annually. I think if I'm quoting now from your paper.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do we start to think about this being upscaled? So if at the moment things are happening in a fairly, let's call it organic fashion, and it's contributing thousands, what are the precursors to upscaling that? And why is it that when we think about things like the housing code, there's no such thing as a backyard policy? There's no chapter in the housing code that deals with this.
To address the scale issue, and I know there's always a danger about talking about the housing problems in terms of numbers, because clearly the housing problem goes beyond just a number calculation. But clearly that is one element that one has to look at. We always seem to try to address the housing problem with new build. And now globally, new build into a city is normally between 1% and 2% of the total housing stock. So you're never going to address your housing problem through new build. Number one, just in terms of the quantum, and two, in terms of the affordability. Because think about it, your new build is always going to be your most expensive stock. You're paying current prices for those properties, so you're never going to address the affordability issue. So rather, what I think we have to do is look at repurposing and increasing the densities of our existing stock. So just to take Cape Town, for instance, there are about 700,000 residential, formal residential registered properties in Cape Town. Approximately about 400,000 of those are single residential units. So there's huge opportunity to upscale on those residential units. Now, where I see huge opportunity there is by using those 400 units to address your problem, you address some of the fundamental economic constraints that hinders housing supply. And just to put it really sort of simply, you have to develop a house where the value of that house is more than what it costs you to build it, unless you're going to use massive government subsidies, which we don't have anymore, basically, right? So you've got to, and so the value side of housing is driven by people's income. And income in South Africa is going to be flat for a long time to come. So we're not going to be able to increase values by improving it with respect to people's income. So we've got to look at the cost side of the equation, right? And so if you look at the major cost drivers in housing, it's what I call the land production problem. It's the ability to get a piece of land to a point where you can put a brick in the ground or however you're building your house. And that land production is really about land ownership, acquiring land. It's about infrastructure, and it's about development rights. If you look at the 400,000 existing properties, we address a lot of those problems instantaneously. Land ownership, people already own that land, right? The infrastructure, there's a large amount of excess infrastructure in those areas. You're not having to put in new infrastructure into those particular spaces. And in many cases, the development rights are in place. So we should be redeveloping and densifying that existing stock. The further advantage of actually doing that is a lot of those existing 400,000 houses are in well-located locations. And if we upscale those and increase the densities of those, you're going to get a massive integration happening in your city as well. So you start to tick a lot of the boxes that we need to tick to address the issues in South African cities by redeveloping our existing stock. And I think the micro developers that we're seeing are showing us how to do that.
I mean, we've seen in Cape Town over the last couple of years the introduction via the bylaw of the second and now even the third dwelling unit as of right, assuming infrastructure and so forth is there. That seems to be a very sort of, let's call it, positive way of looking at that in terms of codifying it and through the regs.
Completely supported. I think it's an excellent idea.
So I've got some statistics here about backyard increases in Gauteng between 2001 and 2016. And the figures increased by 205% between those 2 points. So in 15 years, there was an increase of 205%, which went from about 270,000 units to about 820,000 units over that period. Mm-hmm. Now, what that indicates to me is actually the kind of entrepreneurs that Rob's referring to are important and valuable, but that's not where the action is in Gauteng. The action is in the guys who are doing it on their RDP properties, on their backyards. That's where it's really happening. It's what I think Sarah calls resident-led incrementalism. It's the guys who are saying, yeah, let's put 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever units, rooms on my property, and I'll live there and I'll manage them, or perhaps I may move away, but generally people do live there. And, to my mind, it's something that David Gardner and I argued much earlier, which is they're doing fine. The state just needs to get out of the way. It just needs to facilitate. And to a large degree, one of the things that comes out quite a lot is not people, well, in my experience, it's very anecdotal and it's something that does need a great deal more research, but people have not come back to us and said they need financing. People finance this themselves in a whole bunch of really interesting ways, and access to finance has not been a limiting factor from what I've been able to see. Certainly not in the guys who are resident-led kind of developers.
I mean, Margot, it's interesting what you're saying is government get out the way. The market can deal with this. But I mean, the government will always have a responsibility to play in terms of ensuring basic standards, whether it's around environmental health, whether it's around fire and emergency services, provision of services. I mean, it still has a role to play, not so?
The role to play, yes, but at the moment, the role that we've seen it play has been kind of the role of the jackhammer rather than the role of the facilitator. And I think that's deeply problematic. Is we still need to the state needs to evolve some kinds of mechanisms which are supportive, facilitative mechanisms rather than restrictive kind of mechanisms of erasure, of limitation, or whatever else. So of course the state has a role. What that is and how it has to work, I don't think has been properly conceptualized.
If we're trying to get into a situation whereby there is value in the asset that is being developed, whether it's the backyard, a single shack, or whether it's a double, triple story development on an existing earth, ultimately there's value to be properly derived and gained from that. Ultimately, you need to be able to capitalize that, and that's where the banks and so forth would come in. And ultimately, what they're going to want is certain guarantees that this is not going to fall down, that this has got certain rights ascribed to it. So, I mean, you're saying not, Margot. It's not necessary, no?
My view on this is that these units do have enormous value. It's other work that Sarah and I are kind of undertaking at the moment, which is looking at the market in RDP units. And there has been a fairly vibrant market in people buying and selling RDP units. There's value in this asset. It doesn't need the banks to kind of facilitate that or to provide any kind of to offer anything necessarily into that market per se. So I'm not quite sure what the logic is necessarily of getting formal institutions involved in the sector.
I wanted to come in on this issue about the role of the state and just sort of make one point around that. I agree with Rob's point about really that we need to be encouraging existing residential stock to be going this route, although I have some reservations about exactly what's being said about that. Just before I get there, what we are seeing is the state continuing to supply new build housing through the subsidized housing program, through the RDP. And so while we have a chance to try and influence what's happening there and the extent to which that sort of new build can facilitate further densification through backyarding, I think it's important that we do step in. And one of the trends that I think is quite worrying in Gauteng is that the delivery of subsidized housing in new mixed income developments is looking very different to previous RDP type housing, in the sense that it's taking the form of 3 or 4 story walk-ups, so sort of giveaway flats. And I think that's a response to the critique that has been sort of heaped on the low density sprawling RDP settlements that many of us have been talking about for years. And so as a response to that, a different form of RDP house is being built, which are these flats. But that sort of giveaway unit doesn't actually facilitate a backyarding type of response by the individual homeowner. The important thing that the state has facilitated over the last few years or the last decades has been to enable people who've been living in very poor circumstances with no assets to become landowners, to become property owners, and furthermore to become landlords and suppliers of accommodation through backyarding, which is an incredibly important kind of chain of events, incredibly important for that particular individual who's now able to bring in an income or create extra space for family members living elsewhere to be able to consolidate on one plot, etc. There are multiple spin-offs that we're fairly familiar with. But that sort of process gets interrupted with a different kind of built form that is responding to different imperatives. And that kind of built form, the multi-story one, is responding to the idea that we should be densifying our cities, but it's responding to it in a very different way. And I think we are learning through the backyarding process how important, how rich, how interesting, how diverse, what a contribution that is making to cities and potentially can make to our very problematic South African cities. And so I think that's another reason why we need to be thinking hard and smart about how to facilitate and promote this, rather than that alternative, much more formalized multi-story unit, which I think has got enormous problems as a housing solution for very poor people without a kind of institutional management framework that goes with it. But having said that, and just coming back to the point about encouraging this sort of growth and densification on existing residential properties, if the micro entrepreneurs are doing it, that promotes one form of asset creation, but it leaves behind individual sort of RDP type beneficiary who is a kind of first time property acquirer and first time getting into this market. And I think we have to be quite careful that we're not sort of pushing the one out with promoting the other.
Sarah, can I ask you why you think that would occur? I just want to clarify why you think the one would push the other one out.
I think it goes back to the location story of where it's currently happening. So if one thinks about where it's happening in Gauteng, there's some interesting maps that were produced by the Gauteng City Region Observatory last year that show very clearly the extent of backyarding in former townships, in RDP developments, etc. And most of those are relatively peripheral, basically, for reasons that we know. So not necessarily the best locations. So if one was going to really stimulate the supply in areas around the inner city, for example. So yes, it's happening in Yeoville, as I was mentioning, but if one was to encourage it in Auckland Park, in Melville, further up and down the corridor of freedom, for example, then presumably what one's doing is really stimulating the supply and the availability of rooms for rent. I presume, really encouraging and increasing the volume, but in better locations, in some ways will bring down the desirability of the existing stock that's in the more peripheral locations. And again, poorer people will be sort of the ones able to afford those sort of cheaper rooms there. But perhaps you've got a different take on how that might unfold.
No, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. So it was just an interesting view. I mean, I think to pick up on your point of the provision of the higher density sort of RDP model, it concerns me as well. I understand why it's doing. I mean, why there's this move towards that. As you said, it's probably in response to the criticism of the previous form of RDP housing. One, it does reduce the opportunities in terms of the more homeowner type of development. I think the main problem there is the management thereof. I think it is going to be a huge issue, and that's what I like about both the homeowner micro developer, if I could call it that, and the more kind of and even the enterprise type of micro developer, just to use those very crude categories, is that both deal with the management side of residential occupation, which is a huge issue. And that kind of RDP model, this sort of new RDP model, does concern me in that regard. Pete, just to circle back a little bit to Margot's point, I mean, I would basically agree with her that at a micro level, the state should step out. I mean, it should, just try not to get in the way of the developments on a site-by-site basis. I'm not convinced we need a big brother to control the quality, etc. Because when I've spoken to a lot of the developers, that's their asset. it's in their interest to actually build a sound structure. And yes, you will get exceptions. I understand that. But for the most part, they are committing significant amounts of money relative to their income, etc. And they will, for the most part, make sure that they develop a sound structure. The other thing that I've found since looking at this since 2011, the quality of these developments has improved substantially because the tenants are becoming more demanding. And as there's greater choice and variety being put on the market, the tenants are demanding the quality. So I'm not convinced the state has to play this massive, heavy-handed quality control role. However, I do think the state has a big role to play in these areas, but more at a macro level in terms of provision of proper public facilities, etc. And we've seen that in areas like Dunoon and that have densified dramatically to what was originally planned. And the ability of the public infrastructure, and I use infrastructure in the very broad term here, to cope with that has obviously been put under strain. And I think the state has a much stronger role to play in that way, rather than a sort of quality control, heavy-handed development control manner.
Yeah, I completely agree with Rob. And I mean, I think that what's interesting is if you ensure that there is competition within the market, and this is a new position for me to take market-related position, but anyway.
I like it.
Never mind. I know you do, Rob. I know you do. But we have seen that the more competition there is in the market around us, the better quality the units are produced, because tenants have choice. And it's just what's happening. Yeah. So it's a big one. And, I think the state has to get away from the idea that it has to be the controller of all things. It has to be the contributor of all things. This is working. This is really working. So step back would be kind of, my kind of repeated message on this.
Well, let's look at an example where the state didn't step back, and the one of the pilot projects that I think it was yourself looked at, Margot, was around the pilot project and the backyard pilot project in Orlando and Zola, and there were some very rude awakenings or rude lessons learned from that. Is that something you'd be prepared just to give us some highlights on? What was the impact of when the state, and I think at that stage it was specifically the Gauteng provincial government's efforts to go into those historic suburbs of Orlando and Zola and Soweto and try and get their hands on, or retrofit, let's call it, some of the thousands of back rooms that are being constructed. Any lessons learned from that example?
Yeah, I mean, to just briefly say what happened was that the state offered a subsidy to build 2 units on people's properties who had backyard rooms. And the units were 2 units with a joined shared ablution, from what I remember. People could apply for it, and the deal was that you could only have the 2 units in, and anything in excess of that had to be removed, had to be knocked down, and so on and so forth. I mean, immediately what happened was that 70,000 people were displaced as a consequence of this program of de-densifying and putting in more formal backyard rooms into this environment. And that was a big problem. I mean, people who'd been living there for a number of years were removed. People moved out of homes, which gave them access to transit, gave their kids access to schools. I mean, it was a big problem. And that those people were never addressed. They were eventually just, I don't know exactly what happened to them. I think they were moved on. And then the second thing, of course, is that when people saw the quality of the build of the backyard rooms, which was often a bit better than what had been produced by people on their own, and given that this is a more historical example, this is something that took a long time to happen, was that people often moved their family members directly into these units. So they weren't actually creating additional space, but they became, I mean, and they often are, but even more so, extensions of the kind of core household. And then the third thing that happened is it created enormous resentment. People felt that there was a kind of double dipping, where people who had already received some kind of state investment, often under the apartheid government, where they received state homes, were now receiving an additional subsidy from the post-apartheid government in the form of these new backyard subsidies that were offered. And the argument was, well, why not just give them to the people who are living in the backyards and give them houses? Why give people an opportunity to not only have a home, but then to have some way of getting a supplementary income as well, basically on the dime of the government. So it caused enormous resentment, it caused displacement, didn't necessarily add very much, and in fact it reduced the amount of housing stock that was available. So it was just not a particularly sensitive approach, although I do applaud the Gauteng government for trying to think through and trying to address the issue. It could have been a bit more sympathetic.
Sarah, from your side, anything else in terms of your experience there, particularly in and around Alex and so forth?
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that there was also an interesting initiative done by the Alex Renewal Project, the ARP, creating one of the new developments, the K206 project on Alex East Bank, where they specifically tried to construct 2 backyard dwellings as part of a sort of RDP house delivery system. And I think it was quite an inspired approach, because it was sort of consciously trying to learn from the yards of old Alex, the old configuration, very dense kind of settlement of rooms around a particular yard. So it was kind of picking up on that sort of spatial organization, and also picking up on the notion or the idea that the business of Alex is rental because of its prime location in Johannesburg, and really recognizing that rental accommodation is critical. So this K206 project tried to deliver this interesting built form of an RDP unit and 2 backyard rooms with shared ablutions. But once again, with the state itself trying to do the backyard configuration in an individual owner's plot, it ran into problems. And one of the things I can just recall from that particular case study is the sort of resistance by tenants to paying rent for something that had been built by the government and given to a particular beneficiary. So the rooms and the house had been given away as part of the state subsidized housing scheme. And people who then occupied the rooms said, well, why should we pay rent to this person who's benefited from all of this? So somehow the state's intervention within a private property around this really complicates the story. And I would agree with Rob and Margot's point that a lot is happening very well without state interference in people's individual efforts and initiatives around backyard production.
Margot, if I recall, a lot of the work that you had done looking at some of this urban management in one of your papers was around the urban management lessons there at Cosmo City and the different urban management almost phases that it went through, from a very strong developer, sort of very strict regulatory role, into a more community-led, and ultimately sort of what seems from the research to suggest a deterioration over time as that changed in terms of the enforcement issue. Anything particularly around Cosmo? Cosmo was one of the case studies that we looked at early on in this series of podcasts. Anything on the Cosmo that you would like to sort of reflect on?
I think that it seems to point to how difficult the urban management question is around these issues, and that it's, if I recall correctly, the developer had stepped in and was assisting with some of the urban management to the point where they had people riding around the settlement, the area, on bicycles and reporting back to the developer immediately if people were contravening certain kinds of rules, if they were building shacks or whatever else. And, it immediately points to me to the incredible capacity that is needed to be able to provide good urban management, in settlements, and which doesn't seem to exist very often in many metros or municipalities. I think it points very, very much to that kind of thinking. And that, it's all very well, so let me rephrase that. And that although I'm a big fan of yards and densification and whatever else, it does take its toll on the urban environment. There's no question. This is where I agree with Rob. And that's exactly where the state has to step in. It's got to maintain roads and lights and infrastructure of all these different descriptions in order to facilitate, the larger number of people that are now living in these areas. And what, of course, happened in Cosmo is that over time, developers stepped back and was less and less able to conduct monitoring and less willing to engage in kind of urban infrastructural redevelopment and maintenance. I mean, I think that's the kind of key lesson we need to learn from that.
So, colleagues, as we start to wrap up on this conversation, where can listeners find out more about the research that you've done? Let's start with yourself, Sarah, and Margot, and then Rob, I'll come to you.
We're academics, which is a sad thing for many people, because the way we write and publish work is in this particular format, which is not always the most interesting, perhaps, for people. But Margot and I have published in books and journal articles. One recent one is in a book that talks about massive suburbanization across the world, and it's really this work that's coming out of Toronto, this big project that really focuses on the incredible changes that are happening on the edges of cities across the world, the sort of peripheral urbanization that's happening through state-built housing programs in some instances in places like Addis Ababa, but also the forms of kind of self-build auto construction that it's happening across the world. So we've sort of contributed to that story by drawing on our experience from Gauteng and the backyarding changes that are happening in the suburbs. And then Margot might want to talk about this book on densification that's coming up that we've got something in.
There's a co-edited volume by Alison Todas, Phil Harrison, Ali Applebaum, and myself. And the title of the book is Densifying the City. Within that, Sarah and I have got a chapter which looks at the relationships between landlords and tenants and how that functions, and why people may choose to live in rooms as opposed to living in informal settlements. And it talks to the greater theme of the book, which is around densification, how it's happening, why it's happening, where it's happening within Joburg, and how that compares internationally against a whole bunch of different cities, being Istanbul, Sao Paulo, Curitiba, and so on and so forth. So the chapter is within that kind of large volume, trying to reflect on this relationship between density and relationships of intimacy. So it's a much more, I wouldn't say ethnographic because that could be too far, but certainly a much more qualitative approach to looking at the issue of rooms and backyarding.
I just wanted to add that particular chapter draws a lot on student work from Wits over the years, and these sort of small studies of different forms of backyarding in different locations that we were referring to earlier.
So that's a study that's coming out, a publication that's coming out shortly, correct?
Certainly hoping so before the end of the year. We're just trying to put the final bells and whistles on at this point.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with that. And Rob, your way, where can people find out about the work and the research that you've been doing?
Pete, the main, or probably the easiest way, is to go to the research unit's website, which is www.ureru, so it's ureru.uct.ac.za. And the majority of our research reports and publications can be found there, including the work we've done on the micro developers.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. The way that we're going to conclude this then is to say we're going to fast forward 10 years in the horizon. We are through the COVID-19 in the coming months, all things being well. Life will go on. Density is going to become a massive issue. I recognize that, in terms of the whole question around density and what is the appropriate levels, and we're going to be looking at this in a great deal of soul searching in the coming months. I've no doubt about that. But in 10 years' time, in 2030, 2031, what does our city look like? I'm going to start with you, Rob, then I'm going to come your way, Margot, and then Sarah to conclude. Is it going to look more like what we've been talking about, or is it going to be something that's changed again and has morphed further from the organic, this degree of incrementalism that we've talked about this evening?
Pete, if I had to crystal ball gaze, I think we're going to continue to see this type of development happening in the sort of township type of areas. I think it's going to just upscale. But I actually think this model is going to extend much further into the more conventional sort of suburban areas of our city as well. I think Sarah mentioned that a little earlier on as well. We're already seeing it happening, and I think it's going to occur on a much greater scale. And I think it's going to ramp up quite rapidly as well, where we're going to see the densification of our suburbs along similar lines.
Margot, do you agree with that?
I do, and I think that in places like Joburg, where we've just had this nodal review, which encourages densification in older areas and places where there are more facilities, and it's a move that I applaud. I think that if that is allowed to push ahead and is able to fight back against all kinds of NIMBYism and resident associations and all kinds of things, I think that we really will see this very interesting change in suburbs. And I hope that will happen. But I also think that we're going to see the converse. I think we are going to see these new cities and these kind of fantastical enclaves on the edges of our cities, these areas and other kinds of places, which are going to be built for the elite. And I think a lot of people who can and want to kind of remove themselves from a kind of more mixed kind of environment will push to put themselves into those kinds of spaces as they already have, but in a more radical form.
Sarah, final word from your side.
Thanks, Pete, for that privilege. I would agree with the trajectory of suburbs as being something that's going to happen in the future. I think we should be actively encouraging that and stimulating that and linking it to land reform. We as a country and the state needs to be looking at purchasing perhaps or acquiring in other ways property in well-located parts of the city and transferring that to particular individuals and encouraging backyarding as ways of transforming the city. So in a way, I'm advocating for perhaps a more radical take on how one stimulates this and links it to land reform in cities. But I think I also agree with Margot that we might also see more polarization and enclaving going on. Margot was talking about new cities, but maybe more extreme sort of gated communities versus other forms of transformation happening in cities where other parts of our cities become a bit more informal, a bit less controlled, and diverse economic activity and informal rooms for rent start springing up. Those that can remove themselves from that kind of environment might increasingly do so. That's not a trend I would like to see, but it may happen.
Sorry, Pete, do you mind if I step in here? And my apologies to Sarah if I'm taking her last word. But just to pick up on that, I think it speaks very much to your point about the state intervention, because I think Margot and Sarah are absolutely correct that if the urban management aspect of this trend is not managed, you will see the elite retreating to these enclaves. However, if we address the urban management aspect, based on some of the earlier discussions, particularly with Margot, I think that is one way of reducing that trend from happening. I think a lot of people retreat to those enclaves because of urban management issues. And if some of those urban management issues are addressed, I think I'm not saying one will stop it, but I think one could reduce it. The other thing I'd just like to add with respect to this topic is this is often seen as a housing topic. And I increasingly think it's actually an economic development topic, because the activity that's happening in these areas is one of the dominant economic sectors in those areas. We don't see the role of it from it's seen as something that should be part of a housing policy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm saying, no, it should be seen as part of an economic policy, because besides the supplementary income to households, impact that the construction process happens, that happens with respect to these micro developments is huge. I mean, I've got some anecdotal evidence, but you're looking at about 15 people being employed per site, and the income that gets generated and gets spent stays in that area. It circulates in those communities. So the role that this micro development process, whether it's at a household backyarding level or at a slightly larger, more sort of entrepreneurial level, is massive. And I really think we need to start looking at this much broader or beyond just a housing issue.
Rob, I think that's a fantastic place for us to step off. And thanks for inspiring us with that, and food for thought for all of us. And Colleagues, I really want to thank you again. Many thanks. We've been going at this now for just over an hour, and I think this has stimulated the conversation in so many different ways. We could probably continue talking throughout the rest of the evening. But let's call it there for the time being. And what I would suggest is that, particularly Margot, Sarah, when you're ready with your publication towards the back end of the year, let's check in again there and let's talk to you about that and the specifics of the book launch. Be nice to hear how that goes. And Rob, please stay in contact. Look forward to chatting to you soon. And colleagues, be safe in the coming weeks. Please look after yourself, you and your loved ones. All the very best. And thank you for your time this evening.
Thanks very much, Pete.
Thanks so much, Pete.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.